Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the British Foreign Policy Group. My name is Sophia Gaston. I'm the director here. We are here to discuss what Britain thinks about foreign policy and perhaps even more importantly, the question of why this matters. This is an area that traditionally has been quite understudied. It's a personal passion of mine and something that is the central focus of the work that we've been doing at the BFPG. And this survey project is a really sort of central aspect of that. And this is an ongoing project that we have been running with Opinium Research, who have been our fieldwork partners on this. And we're growing and expanding and deepening all the time. I think very much this work has felt quite pioneering as we've been moving through, but I'm pretty convinced that over the coming years, this is going to become very much status quo and an absolutely kind of just embedded part of how we talk and think about foreign policy. So I'm delighted to be joined today by three excellent panelists who are going to help just make sense of what this means and the kind of political and geopolitical consequences. We have Sir Simon Fraser, who is the founder and managing director of Flint Global, also the deputy chairman of Chatham House, and was previously the PermSec at the Foreign Office and also the head of the business department. We have Gideon Rachman, who is the chief political commentator at the Financial Times, author of many wonderful books, including a new one on strongmen, which I'm sure he will speak to, and Priya Minhas, who is the senior research manager at Opinium, and has been working with me for quite a few years now on the surveys. So the way we'll do this is I'll just present, very quickly rattle through some of the highlights of the survey. It's all there on our website, so we're just going to be scraping the surface today. And then I'll turn to each of our speakers just to give some quick remarks, responses, and thoughts about that. And then we'll have a little chat and then be able to go into Q&A. So we've only got an hour, so we need to be very judicious with our time. So if you can start thinking ahead if there are questions you'd like to ask of our panelists, and we have a little Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you can just put your questions in there, and then we'll field them through. So without any further ado, I am going to just rattle through some of these key findings for you. So overall, the report finds the UK in a state of transition with Brexit and the pandemic receding, but the war in Ukraine, tensions in alliances, and the cost of living crisis is really forging a new period of uncertainty for Britons. Trust in the government on foreign policy. You can see here, this is going across 4 different data points and over the past 2 years. And what you can see here is that for the first time, distrust has really superseded trust levels in the government. It's now a majority position. And what is very much related to this is the politicization of trust in the government. So as you can see here, Conservative voters are still leaning towards trust, although there is a growing trust pillar there, but the other kind of major parties are feeling very distrustful. And I think that very much speaks to this erosion of the concept of a kind of shared bipartisan national interest. One of the very striking aspects of the finding, and this is something that's very unique to this year, is some quite significant falls in Brits recognizing the benefits of globalization. And this is very unusual and remarkable because Brits have been very distinct in our resilient support for globalization through the financial crisis, austerity, in a way that many of our European and American allies have not. So the big 2 areas where that's changing is perceptions of globalization's benefits to the UK outside of London and personal benefits, so me and my family. And here you can see the split between remain and leave. So there is a kind of a phenomenon at work here that we can observe. But I think what is really interesting about this is that they're not actually perhaps as divergent as a lot of the sort of media commentary about this would suggest. Here's some good news about how Brits think about alliances. Do our partnerships internationally make the UK more resilient? very much the story is yes, they do. But here's the more challenging aspect. The UK's closest allies, what we're seeing the most growth in is this point on the far right here, that the UK does not have any particularly close allies at all. That's nearly a third of Brits now believe that. So something really important is going on there. One of the factors contributing to that is the very mixed views about the United States. And here you can see across 5 different questions, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. You have sort of majority or near majority agreement for them. So it shows that Brits are kind of holding a sort of pragmatic and an emotional view about this, which sometimes means that we feel close to America and sometimes means that we don't. And I think that's a pretty significant shift. The other area that we've been looking at in particular is EU relationship. Now, what we have seen is that there is pretty widespread support for engagement with the EU across a varied range of different kind of areas, but this is broken down between Remain and Leave. What you will see here is that the area where Remain and Leave voters come together the most is around trade. And the areas where they diverge the most is around freedom of movement, which is probably of no surprise to anybody. Attitudes towards the 0.7% foreign aid budget restoration. We have seen quite a bit of movement in this, and essentially the most popular view now is that the 0.7 commitment should remain reduced for the foreseeable future. Priorities in free trade agreements, we brought up against each other the kind of 4 most common reasons why people support free trade. And what we can see here, the most important thing, I think, is the separation of the values agenda, i.e. the values of the countries we're trading with, and the standards story, which is, you know, that we want our standards domestically at home upheld in those free trade agreements. They're often areas that get split in the media narrative. This graph is separated between men and women because that is a very consistent finding of our research year on year, is that gender is one of the biggest kind of shaping and influencing factors in terms of determining attitudes. And that's something that certainly hasn't been looked at in any great detail otherwise. The coming together of China and Russia, this is one of the big stories of the past couple of years. In years gone by, China was seen as a much less of a security threat. What we're seeing now is a convergence between the two. You can see that the most popular single answer is that both nations pose the same level of threat. This graph is broken down between Conservative Remain and Leave and Labour Remain and Leave voters. And part of the reason we've done this is just to show that actually, while the debate can feel very political in Westminster about both of these countries, there is actually quite a lot of consensus across all of these different types of voters on these. So this is the story with China now. This is where we are in terms of support for types of UK-China engagement. The kind of balanced approach the British people would want the government to be pursuing is challenging China, and then some cooperation on global challenges like climate change, and a little bit of research collaboration and academic exchange. That's kind of it. The support for economic engagement has fallen, actually, even just in the past year, down to, I think it's about 18%. And as you can see, there's also very little appetite for us to be deploying security resources to the Indo-Pacific to counter China. That's a big challenge for the government in making the case around the Indo-Pacific tilt. Just finally coming to climate action. This is a big story for the UK's international leadership. The integrated review flag, this is our #1 global priority. What we're seeing is an enormous amount of dynamism in this area. It's not around whether we should leave. As you can see here, pretty consistent. People still want us to be leading on this. And I can tell you from focus groups that people still definitely want it to be the biggest priority. But we're starting to see interesting things emerging here. So this is, the question is really, if we are leading internationally on this, are we going to have to transition more quickly at home? And essentially the consensus is that we are. And this is split between higher and lower socioeconomic groups. The difference between them is largely constituted by the lack of confidence in their knowledge in the lower socioeconomic groups. But this is very relevant because this graph, which is, I think, the pointy end of where we're getting to politically at the moment, is so we know we're going to be leading. We know we're going to have to make that transition more quickly. And will these impacts be shared evenly across society? No, they won't. People think that they will have a larger negative impact on the disadvantaged. Now, what's really interesting about this, again, this is graduates, non-graduates, often leaves onto the high, low socioeconomic, is that you have a very powerful coalition here, because you have the people who perceive themselves to be directly impacted, but you also have people with high social and political capital who will be advocating for this. So this is why the government's going to be under quite a lot of pressure on this issue. So I'm going to stop there, and we can now just go into a bit of discussion about what that means. So I'd like first to turn to Simon for his thoughts, and then I'll go around our other panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophia. Well, I think it's a fascinating trove of information, and there's a lot of complexity behind the headlines, so we all need to dig into it. But the overall impression I took away, and I think you've highlighted this, is one of some sort of uncertainty and flux. So perceptions of Britain's international position and reputation in transition, which is, of course, hardly surprising after Brexit and everything that's happened since Brexit, COVID, with China, with Russia, indeed with America. So, not perhaps a nation divided, although there are clear divisions, but perhaps more a nation seeking direction at the moment. And I think that's a fair reflection of the contradictions and tactical inconsistencies of British foreign policy as well, and our performance internationally. And perhaps that helps to explain something you didn't actually major on, but the relatively low awareness and understanding that came through in the survey of the concept of global Britain and its meaning at the moment. Still relatively low comprehension of that. So it's not easy to frame a single coherent thematic comment, but I just want to draw out a few of the findings that really struck me, if I may. First of all, I thought there's still overall quite a high level of interest in international affairs. I think it was 62% amongst respondents, but has fallen significantly from previous surveys. And I suspect that does reflect a mood of heightened domestic concern and lower confidence in British society on a number of fronts. The fall of trust in government, which you did highlight, personally, I don't find very surprising, although you did sort of segment it between different sectors. But actually, the other thing that came out to me is that loss of trust is in fact a wider phenomenon. So the survey seems to reflect also a loss of confidence in the international system and in international organizations and the way in which international affairs are run. I thought the figures that you highlighted on ongoing loss of confidence in the benefits of globalization, particularly outside London and Northern Ireland, were very stark. Again, not surprising to me, but I think likely to become more extreme as we go forward. So it's not new, it's a familiar theme, but it seems to be becoming further entrenched. And you see that perhaps in the attitudes that are expressed in the survey towards the future of international supply chains and trade and the turning inward of countries. What really I found interesting in the report was, and in some ways contradictory, was what it said about the evolution of British relationships internationally. As the report highlighted, there's a sort of loss of emotional content in some of our established alliances, reflecting sort of changes in attitudes. And I think questioning of the continuing relevance of those relationships. And you did highlight that striking number, which really leapt out at me, about the number of people who actually feel the UK doesn't have any close allies, which is surprising to me. But then, equally surprising, and something that didn't come through in the summary, but there were some interesting scores on trust in other countries. And there you find that Germany and France are seen as more reliable and trusted partners than the United States. And now I don't know whether that German figure was taken before Ukraine policy became quite as controversial as it has recently. But I thought that was very interesting, particularly when you then have the next question, which is, nevertheless, which is your preferred ally? and you find the United States is still very much the preferred ally, presumably that's a sort of recognition of continuing the realpolitik of American power. Equally alongside that, there was a very low level of confidence expressed in India as a partner in this survey, which I thought was illuminating and, by the way, I think well-founded. But that perhaps also helps explain the sort of uncertainty around global Britain, because your key foreign policy relationships are there for a reason, and it isn't easy just to sort of pluck alternatives from the ether. And I think that was quite illuminating. Can I just say one final thing quickly about attitudes to the EU? I thought that the attitudes towards the European Union in the survey were quite positive. You mentioned trade. Actually, on freedom of movement of people, there were some quite positive attitudes toward that as well in some sectors. Surprisingly, I think that positive sentiment towards EU cooperation was stronger in the older age group than in the younger. And if that's true, and Priya, maybe you can correct me on that, but I was surprised by that. That I thought was very interesting. The other thing which you didn't bring up, but which I thought was striking, was the high number of people who consider that withdrawal from the EU was actually the single most damaging thing to the UK's international reputation. That figure is still high. And here, the number is much higher amongst the young than amongst the older, which is slightly different from the other finding. And also, there was a very robust number of Brits who are attached to and acknowledge a European identity, 49%. That was higher than the percentage who see themselves as global citizens, 42%, or indeed patriots, which was down from 53% to 45%. So that was interesting. But again, the numbers did show a very strong divide on this question of entrenched divide on European questions. And just on threats, I wasn't surprised about climate change being identified as a high threat. International terrorism was the next highest identified threat. And that was interesting. I personally feel that the public perception of the strategic significance of this threat is exaggerated, and it can distort policy and resource allocation in foreign policy, but it was still very high. And on Russia and China, interesting that they're seen as equal threats. What I didn't see was much understanding of the differentiation in terms of the nature of the threat that they pose, which I think is a different one. I noticed that fear of China is significantly lower in the younger generation. I was struck by that negative figure that you highlighted on the level of support for economic cooperation with China, which has really quite significant implications in terms of the future of the world. So those are the things I wanted to pull out. Some of them are ones that you had identified, others are different ones. But overall, it's a complex picture. I'm not sure if the pudding sort of lacks a theme completely or just simply has no predominant one at the moment. But I do suspect probably the emerging theme is going to be that domestic economic and social concerns are going to crowd out and heavily influence attitudes towards international foreign policy. And by the way, one thing that didn't emerge yet as a significant factor is the potential impact of the breakup of the weakening of the United Kingdom Union as a factor in our international foreign policy influence. I wonder if that would be a more predominant theme in future surveys. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. We have previously polled the breakup of the union as a threat, and it's more often than not the lowest threat in terms of how it's perceived by the British people. I think just to come back on a couple of things you mentioned there, the Germany point, I'm not sure how much it will be impacted by the war in Ukraine, because focus groups we've been doing recently, there's actually very little visibility for the British people of what's been going on in terms of Ukraine response from our allies. They haven't really seen much about that. So maybe that will be to the benefit of Germany's soft power. And I do think that the point that you highlighted there about the Europe story is really significant. So the European identity and perceptions of us in terms of in geographical terms as being in Europe is one of the very, very enduring legacies of the Brexit conversation, also Ukraine and the pandemic. So that was something that was really interesting to me as well, that European identity has ended up being the most consistent and enduring compared to other identities. And I would just finish by saying on China and Russia, the focus groups make clear that one is seen as an economic threat and one is seen as a traditional military threat. But what's happened now is that both of those are seen as security threats. So that is new. Wonderful. I will turn to Gideon now for your thoughts.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really interesting survey, so congratulations on doing it. Yeah, I mean, I suppose my first reaction going through the results was I was kind of impressed by the maturity and nuanced views of the British people. I mean, which is perhaps just to say I agreed with quite a lot of what they were saying. But, you know, if you look at sometimes dip into opinion surveys of the United States, for example, you kind of reel away horrified by the number of people who believe apparently crazy things, actually not so much on international affairs, but say on domestic affairs, high levels of conspiracy thinking and so on. And here, I mean, I think, you know, some of the contradictions that Simon was talking about and that you highlighted, or at least tensions, I would say, reflect real tensions in the world. I mean, these are difficult choices, particularly around, I mean, you asked me to think about the stuff on alliances. And again, I think that it is pretty nuanced. As Simon said, people say that the US is the most important ally, and yet they have higher levels of trust in France and Germany. That seems to me a rational response to the way the world is. Obviously, given America's military power, the intelligence relationship, etc., and actually given Brexit, the US is incredibly important to us, more important than France and Germany in a crisis. That is where we will look to. And yet, I think there's a recognition, which is shown in the numbers, that America's is domestically unstable now. You know, just look at the January the 6th hearings going on right at the moment. And that therefore there has to be some sort of ambiguity that we have to live with this in this American relationship. And I'd say actually on this, I think the public are slightly ahead of the government. I mean, it was interesting talking to people who are involved in the strategic review and so on, that there was a reluctance to even discuss what the implications of, you know, the threats to American democracy are for Britain. People just in government don't want to look at it. I think it's just too big. It's too scary, really. Whereas I think that the British public clearly are beginning to think about that. They haven't come up with an answer to it because there isn't really a good answer, but they're aware of the dilemma. Similarly, I was struck that despite, you know, how many years of really scratchy relations with France and Germany post-Brexit, we're now into the 6th year of, you know, at an official level, relations, as you know, with France are really terrible. And that's reflected in a lot of popular papers and so on. And yet, actually, you know, underlying attitudes to France and Germany are surprisingly positive. So I'm impressed that people can see beyond that. So that is, and it's also quite a hopeful sign that there isn't this kind of lasting mistrust. I also think there's an interesting distinction there between the importance of the overall relationship and the alliance. So that if I'm remembering correctly, people say that the EU relationship is the most important, which it is on a day-to-day basis in terms of trade, you know, human interaction and so on, but that the alliance with America is most important. And I think that is a meaningful distinction and one that is actually reflected in the survey. I was also very struck by very high levels of mistrust of China, which again, I actually think are justified, but I'm surprised the public have got there quite so quickly, in the sense that, you know, if you look at all the other things that are coming at us, the reasons for mistrust of China, I guess, would be, you know, threats to Taiwan, what's happening in Xinjiang, what happened in Hong Kong, etc. But these are not issues that get intense coverage in the British media, but it's obviously filtered through. I would be interested to see, you know, when you do the next survey after Ukraine, how people's view of the Russia-China relationship has evolved, because obviously that is a very important question. But I think the extent to which people, again, have already identified the two countries as almost as threatening as each other surprises me, but I don't think is is necessarily wrong. And again, there are no obvious answers to that, but maybe that is reflected in the falling trust in globalization and in trade, because I think, again, policymakers are having to think now about the implications of pursuing a trade relationship with China and the security implications of that, and that's reflected in the survey. So overall, I think that the British public are pretty on the ball, really. I mean, and to the extent that there is a lot of remaining ambiguity, that reflects the fact that there really aren't easy answers to these questions.
I completely agree with you on the sort of pragmatism and level-headed nature of the British people. It's one of the things I'm always very struck by. In focus groups, people where you get to understand how those opinions are being formed. It's very clear that the British people are very comfortable holding contradictory and kind of complex and nuanced views. Often the way that's channeled and represented through the media, it doesn't sort of give the whole story. I think the reckoning on the United States, I agree with you, is one of the areas that feels very much that the British people have caught up to reality more than institutionally the sort of monumental nature of that has been accepted. I would just say as well, just to add a little bit from focus groups we've been doing recently on the EU, absolutely clear that both Leave and Remain want to move on from Brexit, and very much that this needs to be a constructive relationship. It makes people feel quite unsettled now for things to be in a difficult space. They don't want these kind of really bombastic expressions of political theatre anymore. They're tired of that. So I think that in a way is something where the government can find a way to be led as well by the consent of the British people in a way that maybe perhaps defied some of the political logic of even a few years ago. I would just say on China, it's so interesting that the development of the mistrust, I would say, or distrust, that, for a few years now, concern about China has been growing, but it's had quite low salience. It's the Ukraine story, in a way, has unlocked something that was previously quite abstract, far away in terms of time and in terms of geographical proximity, compared to Russia, which is a deeply, deeply established visceral security threat. What has happened now in that Ukraine moment, where they could understand that some kind of alliance or pact or working together could be possible, and the implications of that is that China now comes into a much clearer security frame. So that, I think, is something that is transformative, and I suspect will endure well beyond the war in Ukraine. Priya, I'd like to bring you in now. Priya has obviously been working with me as a fieldwork partner on this for some years now, but obviously working at Opinium, one of the kind of leading polling firms here in the UK. You also have a breadth of other data on all sorts of kind of related and interdependent topics. So very keen for your thoughts on how this kind of links into other piece of work that you've been doing, and any other kind of just general takeaways you had from this piece of work.
Thanks, Sophia. So I'm going to draw out on some of the key findings, and as Sophia mentioned, bring in some other research we've been doing to add a bit of context. So on the point about trust in the UK government to make foreign policy decisions collapsing, that's firstly from our other research not something that we find that surprising, given some of the events that have taken place over the past few years. So with Afghanistan, that's actually a really good example of a major foreign policy area that was perceived quite negatively by the British public. The general perception of that was that it wasn't handled very well. So our half did think that the decision for NATO to go in and invade Afghanistan in 2001 was the right decision. In terms of how people then exited, that wasn't seen as well. So around 1 in 3 think NATO should have stayed until they were no longer needed, rather than withdrawing when they did. Only 9% think it was right for them to have left when they did, and 10% think they should have left before the point that they did. And then the impact of that actually on the public goes beyond just thinking about how the UK government mishandled it from an external point of view, but also it affects the way that the public feel about security here in Britain. We actually polled the public around the time that the Taliban took back control over Afghanistan, and we found that more than half of the public felt that the UK was less safe from terrorist attacks now that the Taliban had taken back control over Afghanistan than was the case before the takeover, which is a very stark finding there. You would have thought that with Ukraine, that could have helped the government in regards to trust regarding foreign policy, but we've actually still seen from the public, it's a mixed bag. Overall, the way that the UK has provided military equipment for Ukrainian troops has gone down really well and has been seen about the right amount that we've been helping out. However, there are two other clear areas that the public think the UK hasn't gone far enough with in its response. So the first one for that is handling the refugee side of things. The public think the UK could have done more on that. That was also the case in regards to Afghanistan as well. But also the second point is around keeping up diplomatic pressure on Russia. The UK public still think the UK could have done more around that. And then, of course, there's Brexit. Less than a third approve of the way that the government is handling Brexit. That's the latest polling we've done has shown that we've kind of kept a track of that over time. And then 45% disapprove. So that's quite a big difference there. And then among the public, a third think that Brexit has gone well, well over half, 56% think it has gone badly. And then if you actually look at Leave voters as well, a third of them say that Brexit has gone worse than expected. So in terms of foreign policy handling, we have seen some really big perceived failures there with only a few qualified successes. I think secondly, trust in government in general, though, has declined, and that in itself takes a toll on foreign policy as well. So for example, if we look at the trust in the Conservative Party to have the nation's best interests at heart, that has dropped from 37% this time last year to 25% at the start of this year. And then, of course, we also have Boris Johnson, and trust in him to stand up for Britain's interests abroad has also declined around that time frame. So back in May 2021, 44% agreed that he did stand up to Britain's interests abroad, compared to 33% who didn't. And that's now flipped the other way around. So in February, when we polled that, 30% agreed to that compared to 47% who disagreed. So in that kind of context of general mistrust of government, it's quite hard to see how the government can get any successes at all, and particularly foreign policy successes. And then turning to globalization, as Sophia mentioned earlier and showed on the chart, there has been a decline in support. We don't have that much additional data on this, but there is a general sense that the experience of the past few years hasn't really helped with globalization. So firstly, with COVID, that's actually ended up making the public concentrate more on the local and on the insular, despite the fact that it was a huge global event. And secondly, we've seen from other recent polling data that the focus has become more hyperlocal. If we put it on a polar scale, 60% think the government should focus on problems at home rather than intervening actively in the problems in the wider world, where only around 15 to 20% agreed with that aspect. So this therefore poses a challenge in terms of building up that support for globalization. And then the findings on America were interesting. The US is by far still perceived as our closest ally. Our relationship has always been quite complicated with the US, and recently even more so during the time that obviously Trump was in power. There's very much a Trump scare. Before that, you could say we had a bit of an Iraq scare. But from a foreign policy perspective of more recent times, Afghanistan has still not covered the US in any glory. Back in August, when we polled on Joe Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan, 48% thought that was the wrong decision, and only 20% thought it was the right decision. So that being one of the major examples in sort of the past year, it's probably not that surprising we still have a complicated attitude to the US, despite the fact that we now have Biden there as president and Trump having gone. And it's a very similar story with the EU, that overall the view is very complicated. We regularly actually do polling with the Observer with Brexit check-ins. And last month, we did another one, and we found still consistently that the public continues to have mixed views. And as Sophia said earlier, while there is a consensus that now we just need to get on with it, what that actually looks like, there's less of a consensus around. So around 1 in 4 think we should negotiate a closer relationship with the EU than we have now. But 1 in 5 think we should keep the relationship as it is right now, and 17% think we should negotiate a more distant relationship with the EU. So there you can see there's not, basically the public doesn't really know what it wants from the EU. On the other hand, some of the research we saw earlier that Sophia showed, that while we don't have a clear vision of what our relationship overall should look like, there are still important individual areas that we want more from. Yes, finally on concerns about net zero transition. This is a key long-term policy of this government, and support for it does remain robust. There are, however, challenges around it, especially if we look at the increasing turn away from globalization, and if we look at the context of the cost of living crisis, that poses some further concerns. We did conduct some further work with the Conservative Environment Network at the end of last year, where we tested a bunch of trade-offs on how we can sell net zero to the public. And the public on principle are behind net zero, and they like that the UK leads the world on that. But it's much easier to sell it in if we put a patriotic slant on it. So if the slant that we put on it is about subsidizing British industries and making it harder for foreign companies so that we're giving protection to British companies and the public get behind that a lot more, they're much less likely to get around a slant where Britain has to make zero-sum sacrifices. They're just much less positive on that. What we don't know is how this will play out when we do have these real problems on our hands and cost of living starting to bite in. So while the public do want to do the right thing, doing the right thing is going to be a lot harder when you're struggling with costs in your day-to-day life. So it's going to be interesting to see what the impact of the cost of living is going to have on public sentiment around a lot of these concerns. But yeah, I would mirror what everybody else is saying and saying this is a very complicated picture everywhere. There's not really one particular theme that comes through, but it's a really interesting research area to have been involved with.
Thanks so much, Priya. I think, I would say just even from focus groups I've been doing over the past month, we are seeing the cost of living situation really dramatically influencing things. And I mean, I think on the net zero, as I said earlier, it's not that they don't want it to be a priority. It's just that now you hear people saying things like, should it be the number one priority? Could it just be one priority amongst others? And that has really profound implications, because if we've said this is our number one international area, we've had a huge amount of legitimacy on the world stage in being able to advance this and advocate, because people know that at home you've got that really robust level of support. That starts to falter. It becomes more difficult for us to assume that. So I just sort of holding on this point, I just wanted to run through a couple of areas that jump out at me that are sort of areas where the government's policy is probably going to come up against tension, either existing now or something that will be exacerbated during the cost of living crisis, and thinking about how this might affect how we do our foreign policy. So obviously the globalization point, economic engagement with China, 0.7 reinstatement, which, I mean, that was enshrined in the integrated review. Migration pathways, so really extraordinary things that three of kind of the biggest acts of global Britain thus far have all involved migration pathways. So BNO from Hong Kong, Afghanistan, evacuation, and Ukraine. But we're starting to see again, in the same way with the net zero, there's this activation of a zero-sum frame now that is definitely pulling on the kind of willingness to be devoting resources externally. I just want to get your thoughts, Simon and Gideon, about how you think that might change the way in which we do foreign policy. I mean, do you think this is really going to be bearing down heavily? I mean, do you think the government will find ways to sort of lead and try and bring the British people along on this? Or do you think we're going to have a much more kind of, I suppose, kind of defensive and security and domestically conscious foreign policy over the next few years in this kind of bumpy period? Simon?
Well, I mean, I think that, you're right to identify those obvious tensions, and they will continue and they will become more acute. I think the government will try to maintain a sort of forward-leaning position in international affairs. I mean, it needs to. It's part of its whole sort of raison d'etre as a post-Brexit government. As we talked about the Global Britain project, we want to be world-leading in many areas. That's part of the government's rhetoric and self-image, but it is going to be much more difficult. It's going to have to be balanced very carefully against the recognition and response to acute pressures at home. which we're seeing. We've got the new inflation figures out this morning. We're seeing the strikes and everything. The government is struggling to find positions on that, and I think it's going to become very acute. And as Priya says, it's going to become manifest in areas such as net zero investment and so forth. And so it is going to be difficult. I think the government will keep a positive rhetoric on globalization and international openness. I mean, it may adapt it, but that doesn't remain its fundamental posture. I think on China, it will continue to try and split the difference. So it will be strong on security, but won't want to close the doors on economic cooperation. Though we're seeing, for example, if you look at the new legislation on national security screening of investment, that there's a lot of pressure on the government to invoke those new powers, which could, for example, have an impact. Migration in its different formats is going to be very, very tricky. I mean, they haven't got a lot of credit for the migration pathways, and they've got potentially a lot of downside in perceptions of attitudes towards we might call illegal migration or unauthorized migration. Although actually in the statistics, there's quite a lot of support in your numbers for offshore processing of migrants, so wherever that happens. So I think the government will, I don't think it's going to fundamentally change its postures, but it's going to find it more difficult to manage it. The only other point I'd want to say is I think the government will find that what it lacks is leverage. And this has always been one of my arguments post-Brexit, that the European Union was one of our instruments of leverage. So if you take Ukraine, for example, we get a lot of credit for our posture on Ukraine and for supporting Ukraine. But what do the Ukrainians want? They want EU membership. And that is not something that's in our gift. So that's an interesting example of leverage in my mind.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, I mean, one of the fundamental challenges here for the government is that responding to a lot of the fundamental kind of structural issues that were brought up in the Brexit referendum, and the kind of I suppose articulating and realizing the vision of what the sort of post-Brexit future for Britain is going to look like requires a lot of money. And we are obviously now in a situation where our finances are even more constrained. So does taking a more security conscious posture. I mean, you mentioned the National Security Investment Bill there. I mean, one of the challenges is the limitations of our capacity to be taking golden stakes income deals. If we're saying we don't want China investing in our 5G networks, if we don't want them investing in our nuclear power plants, we have to find new sources of investment there. And in a lot of cases, there's going to be questions raised about whether the government can actually afford to be that bridge until we can find other investors, or to be taking significant financial stakes. And it seems difficult to kind of put two and two together and think about how we're going to pursue both that domestic project and also a more security conscious national security project when we're in this time of really constrained resources. So I think it feels like something's not all kind of adding up, and that to me spells a pretty bumpy decade ahead. Gideon, I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that, and also your thoughts about the domestic situation in some of our allies. I mean, the US continues to be reticent about engaging in trade, which, has all sorts of implications. Obviously is not pursuing membership of CPTPP in the same way that we are. You've got France now. Macron is moving into a more difficult domestic situation there. Germany seems at a real inflection point. What does it look like for the Western Alliance to have so many complicated domestic mandates when you're trying to work together? How do you think this is going to play out over the next couple of years?
Well, I mean, it's the right question. It's so hard to figure out the answer to it, because obviously so much of it is contingent on developments. I mean, just on the earlier point about how do we trade off the lack of resources with the increasing security consciousness? I mean, I think you put your finger on something very important, which is that the government's Brexit Global Britain agenda had a kind of internally coherent answer to that, which is that we're going to be the most open country in the world. We're going to encourage investment from all over the world. The Chinese will build our nuclear power stations. We'll welcome in everybody. But that is not the world we're any longer in, partly because of pressure from the United States, but, actually in some ways legitimate pressure. I was thinking about the 5G and so on. But now there's pressure also to clean up the city from Russian money, and Russia's just the leading edge of increasing awareness of, well, who do we really want to do business with? So I think some of the, that kind of leaves global Britain in a slight problem, which then comes back to your question of alliances. Yes, I mean, I think it's a paradoxical moment for the West. I think it's both a sort of a hopeful period and one where you can see trouble ahead. On the hopeful front, actually, the Western alliance came together much more rapidly and more effectively on Ukraine than people thought. America was integrated into it, led it, but the EU's passed 6 sanctions packages, and I think that really rather surprised Putin, who had, I think, believed his own rhetoric, and it's a rhetoric they share with China about that the West's decadent, that it's falling apart, etc. But the fear must be that that bet will prove correct in the long run. If you see the rises of the Mélenchons, just this week in France, what might happen in the Italian elections, and so on. But and obviously the looming threat of a return of Trump in the United States in a couple of years' time. But I don't think you can say anything definitive about it, except that perhaps the more the threat grows, the external threat grows from Russia and China, the more likely that is to produce a coherent Western response. I mean, it's interesting, for example, that people like Salvini in Italy, who are very kind of pro-Putin, are very much on the back foot for the moment. So perhaps actually Western unity will survive simply because people will understand the need for it much more.
Priya, I do wonder whether, we've obviously been very much trying to unpick what's going on with the alliances situation here, because I would say we do a lot of comparative work looking at the Lowy Institute surveys in Australia, Chicago Council in the US. And in my conversations with them, they've been so struck by the results in the UK on alliances, that this does seem to be something very specific that's going on with the UK at the moment. Even, in Europe, obviously, you've got the kind of idea of you're still in the European community. So we're just not seeing these kind of results anywhere else amongst our allies. There's something going on. In our focus groups, people constantly talk about this idea of Britain being alone, that we're sort of standing alone, kind of in this European environment, but we're isolated, and talking about we're an island isolated there. And I think, there's something about the alliances story that builds into that, but I also think that there's something about the kind of end of the Cold War narrative, where you had a kind of single threat, and now you've got this multipolar threat, which feels more complicated to people, and I think makes them feel a bit more insecure. Do you have any other data or kind of thoughts on the sort of way in which people are looking at the world now, and how what's making them feel unsafe? And I think earlier, to Simon's point about terrorism, we haven't had kind of any major attacks for a little while now, and yet that still seems very, very resilient in people's minds. Why do you think that's playing such a significant role in how people are thinking about their personal safety and security?
Well, I would say in relation to terrorism, even though we've not for a while, touch wood, had anything happen here in the UK, but you are still seeing things happening around the rest of the world, and so people aren't cut off from that. They're seeing that. And then with Afghanistan, as we saw from some of the earlier stats, seeing a party come in power, that's probably the incorrect way to say it, but a party come in power now who is seen as more of a threat, then makes people feel that, oh, okay, actually now the chances of something happening here is going to increase compared to a previous government that was in place there. So in that sense of people feeling like the UK is alone, they are still paying attention to what is going on around everywhere else, and then that is impacting the way they are feeling about how things could go here in the UK and what could be happening. But I would also say in terms of alliances and the feelings around that is really complicated. We saw that with Brexit, with the quite clear, almost 50-50 split amongst the public around how they felt about it, what they want happening. And even when we were looking at, okay, well, what type of relationship do they want out of the EU? There's just not any clear consensus. So I would say there are certain groups as well that feel more strongly about the way things have gone. So younger people are a lot more pessimistic than older people tend to be. So there's not really one clear consensus about how we as the UK as a whole are doing, or the fact that we're alone. Younger people do have more of a feeling that they identify with the Europe and the EU than older people do. So it's quite a complicated question to answer because there's not really one clear consensus amongst the public. There are a lot of different things going on amongst different demographics there.
I want to bring in a couple of the questions. We've got a very varied range of questions. One of the questions that's just come through is about the Indo-Pacific tilt, and I think this is really interesting because it's obviously not an area that the British people know very much about, but my sense is that generally there's kind of a broad support for us having a role in that sort of security theatre, but also that, you know, the European security theatre remains the kind of primary space in which we're thinking about those sorts of things. And I think that has intensified with Ukraine. Simon, Gideon, I'd be interested in your thoughts about whether or not you think that the nature of the Indo-Pacific tilt might be evolving or need to evolve in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, because you know, I think in a way there is probably going to be a more challenging case for the government to make to the British people on this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been a debate that's been sort of around in security diplomatic circles for a while. I mean, I very much remember being actually in Australia when the British were first beginning to talk about this. And, you know, by and large, obviously the Australians are very, very welcoming of this. But there was a discordant note from a Australian military guy who said, look, you don't have enough resources to send half your navy around to the Indo-Pacific. You should be worrying primarily about Russia closer to hand. And I think that, you know, we're still in a slight sort of cake and eat it phase on this. We want to do everything. And there is an underlying strategic rationale for it, which is I think that there's a sort of trade-off that if we can maybe in our minds prove to the Americans that we're very useful to them or with them in upholding the rules-based order, as they would put it, in the Asia Pacific, that actually kind of strengthens their commitment to Europe, that this is a sort of global alliance that's going on. And the Americans, I think, do increasingly see Russia and China as connected threats. And so that is why I think that we're out there. But I can see that, you know, there are all sorts of questions about leading with your chin. You know, might the UK be a more attractive target than, say, the American Navy if the Chinese wanted to demonstrate something? You know, do we have enough in terms of resources? And those, I think, are reflected in the ambiguity. And I think that the British public, as reflected in your survey, are slightly more, I hesitate to use the word isolationist, but they are more wary of certain forms of international engagement, international aid, and also sending the military out to the Indo-Pacific. But I think that those are legitimate questions. I mean, I think that among foreign policy thinkers, you can understand why we've got to these more advanced positions on them, but they're not self-evidently, you know, they don't stand up to inspection necessarily on the first viewing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the other areas we touched on a little bit, but the point about military interventionism and the just complete lack of, and well, I should say, highly conditional support for British military deployment in kind of such a limited number of scenarios, that does also feel like a very sort of powerful force that's going to be constraining the choices the government can make.
Is that a post-Afghanistan thing, do you think, partly?
That is a post-Iraq thing. Yeah. And I would say on Afghanistan, one thing I was quite surprised about when I was doing focus groups last year was just how much the British people were watching that. It was like everybody had seen this, everybody had a view. And I think perhaps that was a little bit surprising. Not to the longevity. I mean, Ukraine was a full 6 weeks of people glued to that story, but people were very invested in the Afghanistan story as well. And I think it's because it so much spoke to that time 20 years ago that has been really profound in shaping how people see the world and what they want from the UK in our international role. Simon, your final thoughts?
Well, just on the Indo-Pacific tilt. I mean, I'm fine with that as long as it's sort of, handled in a sort of proportionate way and is, a tilt, not a wholesale shift, and not represented as an alternative foreign policy, from a foreign policy which also takes account of our important, security and economic interests in Europe. And so I think if it helps the government to get the balance of that right, then the sort of Ukraine reminder is not necessarily a bad thing. But we do have to bear in mind, it's really important, I think, and I hope Gideon would agree with this, that actually if you're the United States, they still see China as the big strategic question, not Russia. And, if we want to be a close ally of the United States, we have to work through that prism. And therefore, we've got to work out how we can be an effective partner internationally in that particular part of the world, as well as in our own neighborhood. And there are constraints on us, but I think it's the right thing to be trying to do and to be trying in a realistic way to participate in. My very final thought, I'm glad you mentioned the issue about military intervention, but I just wanted to pick up in the end, and this goes back to Gideon's point about the sort of phlegmatic nature of the British people, perhaps. You have a very interesting chart at the end which says, well, thinking about how difficult the world is, how safe do you feel? And it's spread out, the responses are spread out, but the largest single cohort of respondents to that question amongst the people you asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, said they felt at 7, where 10 is very safe and 1 is not safe at all. So actually, despite all this uncertainty and transition, the British people are not feeling too frightened about their position in the world.
Yeah, and an optimistic note to end upon. I would just flag in that perception of individual safety, which is something we've been asking for a few years now. And it has been relatively consistent even through the pandemic. We haven't seen any kind of really dramatic shifts in that, which is encouraging. There are quite significant gender differences in that, which I think is very important, and kind of politically important as well. But it is interesting. We will go through this and highlight, obviously, all the areas that are challenging for the government, but there's also some really good foundations here for an active, kind of very engaged, responsible British foreign policy that is kind of both strategically sharp and values oriented. So in many ways, I think this government has a very good basis on which to be enacting and developing the Global Britain Project into something meaningful. But of course, there can't be any complacency with these other areas, particularly when you have a cost of living crisis of this magnitude, inflation crisis, and energy crisis all coming together. I think, we should be prepared for some bumpy roads ahead. I promised to finish on exactly on time, so we have done that. Thank you so much to Simon, to Gideon, to Priya, and also thank you to our wonderful audience and all your exceptional questions. I have been weaving them into the discussion, answering them as we go. The full report is on our website. All the methodological information is in there as well if you want to troll through it. It's obviously an enormous beast. We will be doing more research. I'll be working on a paper looking at some of those inflection point issues, domestic sentiment, and how that might impact our foreign policy. That will be coming out in the next couple of months. Priya and I'm sure we'll be pulling again some of these really volatile dynamic areas over the year to see how things are moving. So yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your interest in the British Foreign Policy Group and the work that we're doing here, and very grateful to our panelists for our time. We'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.